So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Harris. I'm with the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. We're going to break with tradition a little bit here and get started pretty close to 6 o'clock. And I do so because I'm really pleased that we have a special guest with us tonight. I want to start off by saying that this event really is the result of Anuj and Matt from Bo from the Mass Bar Foundation Committee. What is it? The Civil Rights and Social Justice section.
We just wanted to do this with you, David.
Who actually contacted me several months ago and said, were you guys thinking about doing anything for Brown at 65? And I said, well, we hadn't really thought about it. And I realized that we had never actually done a Brown event in all the time that we've been here, and that it was a great idea. And so in point of fact, this really owes to them. It also owes to my colleague, Susan Eaton, and the Sillerman Center, who helped with the funding for this and some of the logistics. And I also have to thank, as always, give all thanks and praise to my colleague, Kelly Garvin, without whom none of these events would ever happen, and certainly not happen as well as they do. So let me begin by saying I'm actually 68 years old, right? And I'm truly a child of Brown. Brown came down 3 years before I was born, 3 years after I was born, and shortly before I entered elementary school. And I've come to realize I'm contemplating retirement myself and wondering whether I can and when I can afford it as well. And I've come to realize the need for a diversified portfolio for myself, including some stable instruments and possibly some riskier investments. And as Brown reaches 65, I have to wonder if maybe we've put too many eggs, too many dollars in the desegregation account over the years. So I'm hoping to kind of think about that a little bit today. The question occurs to me not only because tomorrow we mark 65 years of Brown, but in August, we observe 400 years since the first captive Africans were brought to Jamestown. The two are not unrelated, and we need to keep them both in mind as we think about our future and the structural racism that continues to define us. I was struck when I read Representative Bobby Scott's comments to the House Committee on Education and Labor in observance of this anniversary. While he lamented the massive $23 billion gap in funding we face today, he also noted that increases in per pupil funding that characterized the early days of desegregation led to improved test scores for Black students attending, quote, integrated schools. Scott went on to point out that, quote, integration does not work because children of color are incapable of achieving without white peers. Rather, he insisted, integration works because it impacts school spending and school practices. Those of you who know or follow our Twitter feed will know that my colleague, Katie Naples Mitchell, created a powerful and provocative thread flowing from my observation that the reality that integration cannot cure structural racism. And that's what Bobby Scott's comment points out. But in preparing for today's event, I was also reminded of Chief Justice Warren's comment that today, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. Compulsory school attendance laws and great expenditures for education both demonstrate our recognition of the importance of education to our democratic society. It is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. Of course, that's the line that we all remember. In today's world, questions of citizenship are loaded, but we at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute think in terms of those from Professor Ogletree's in his All Deliberate Speed, when he described the Civil War amendments as a, quote, reinterpretation of citizenship as a much loftier aspiration than simple freedom from interference. It invokes the positive rights to participate in a community. Professor Ogletree went on to insist that, quote, hundreds of thousands of Americans of all races had fought and died over the character of the polity and equality of membership and participation in American society itself. Membership and participation, not voting and passports, are the markers of citizenship. And today, 65 years after Warren wrote, we have come to appreciate our society remains mired in systems of exclusion that deny both of these to large segments of our population. I'm really pleased to have Professor Ogletree with us tonight, and I think it's a special honor, and I'd like us to take a moment to show our appreciation. So we gather today in joyful appreciation of Professor Ogletree and humbled by the passage of time and perhaps our naivete that the fix would be as simple as we might have thought. But we also gather with a growing awareness of these exclusionary systems that mark us. Racism, to be sure, but also, for example, xenophobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, misogyny, patriarchy, and white privilege. We are hopeful that as we consider the promise and limitations of this landmark decision, as we ponder the deliberate speed with which these years represent, we might find hope in our greater understanding of the systems at work and thereby expedite their dismantling. Thank you very much again for being here. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Matt Krager.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, and huge thanks to the Houston Institute, to Professor Ogletree, to the Silliman Center, and to my colleagues at the Mass Bar Association, including Bo Keeley and Anuj Kedarpal for making this happen. We are not going to do the type of introductions where you read people's resumes, because these resumes are far too long to read, and you probably already know these folks already. Same way, right, if I went through and shouted out everybody that we see in this room tonight, it would be like a graduation ceremony, okay? This is about convening family together, and we're honored that we've come together in this space. So thank you for being here. And what we'll use this time is to be in dialogue, first with each other, right? Our goal as moderators is to do as little as possible and to let our panelists engage each other, and then to allow you all to do the exact same thing. Okay, so without doing that kind of resume reading, I do want to speak from my heart about the people who are on this panel, because they're incredibly special people, as you all know. Justin Hansford is a law professor and the executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University School of Law. Justin comes to his work through critical race theory, and like so many who do so right by that legacy, his work focuses on combining that theory with practice and action. And that's what Justin did when we were law school students and baby lawyers together. And it's certainly what he did as a young law professor in St. Louis upon Michael Brown's murder, where he supported community and the Brown family in bringing truly global attention to Michael Brown's killing and discriminatory policing in the United States, in part by bringing that global lens that he does and authoring a shadow report to the United Nations and working with the Brown family and Ferguson activists to testify in Geneva. I'm going to just keep going down the line, but I feel like I should save Barbara Fields for last. Barbara is the former senior officer of the Boston Public Schools Office of Equity, serving in that role throughout Boston's court-ordered desegregation efforts. Simply put, nobody knows Boston's desegregation effort better than Barbara Fields. And between the intent of that order and the end results in our city, Barbara knows all of it, including where all the bodies are buried in this city's work, right? And if you live in Boston, you probably already know this, right? But she is the heart of our city's continued fight for racial justice and equity in education. And that's something that she's done as a longtime member of the Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts Executive Board and as a founder of the Boston Network for Black Student Achievement. And I'd say this for all of us, including you, Rasan Hall, she's one of the people who can pick any of us up by the nape of the neck and set us in the right direction to make sure we're doing the work, okay? Next to Barbara is Honorima Bhargava. Honorima is the president of Anthem of Us, which is a strategic advisory firm that works with educational institutions and corporations to promote dignity and justice for all. And I can say this, from film production to voter mobilization to cutting edge litigation, Honorima does whatever the hell she damn well pleases. And it moves us forward as a country and as a globe, okay? And rightfully so. So look, there are about 200 outstanding school desegregation orders left in the United States of America. And we used to say that about half of those were in the hands of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and half of those were in the care of the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Well, when Anu hired me at the Legal Defense Fund, she was the director of the education practice and had a hand on each of those, and then left to become the head of, or the chief of the Educational Opportunities section of the Civil Rights Division under the Obama administration's Department of Justice. So that means she's touched about every single remaining school desegregation case in this country, and it also means that for this one brief moment, the left hand really knew what the right hand was doing in the way that we could move this work forward, okay? And then finally, Susan Eaton is a professor of practice in social policy and the director of the Sillerman Center for the Advancement of Philanthropy at Brandeis University. She is the author of about 24 things you need to go out and read right now, and that includes Integration Nation, Immigrants, Refugees, and America at its Best, as well as powerful chronicles of desegregation efforts in Metro Boston and Hartford, Connecticut, and together with Gary Orfield of Dismantling Desegregation. It is so damn hard to capture hope with an eye for realism. But that is what Susan Eaton does better than anybody else, right? And it's exactly what she brings to her work and does so damn well. So that may come to me best with the work that she does with our friend Gina Quiriquinho in One Nation Indivisible, which is a storytelling project to amplify the voices and work of this room and those who are creating and sustaining racially, culturally, and linguistically integrated schools. So, family, this is our conversation tonight. And we want to give each of our panelists some time to kind of bring their perspective to the room before they start engaging with each other. And we've asked Justin to go ahead and start.
All right. All right, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So we find ourselves 65 years after Brown versus Board of Education, facing many of the same problems that we thought we were going to address in 1954. But what I want to do is take a different and more, to me at least, more critical approach to this problem by looking at it through the lens of critical race theory. As a critical race theorist, along with Matt, we started a journal for critical race theory at Georgetown Law Center. I don't want to tell you how long ago that was, very long ago. But many of you know Derek Bell, former professor here, who was in many ways the founder of critical race theory. And 43 years ago, he wrote an article called Serving Two Masters. In this article, Bell raised questions as to whether, as early as 1976, when this article was written, civil rights lawyers' commitments to school integration as a remedy had already been completely scuttled, and whether their goals were misaligned with the interests of their communities. I want to read a quote here from Professor Bell. As early as 1976, and if you look back at the cases, I don't want to bore you with too many cases, but we had A number of cases as early as 1973, including Milliken versus Bradley, and another case coming out of San Antonio, which seemed to eliminate the possibility for school busing to be used as a remedy for school desegregation. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about busing in the future. So only two or 3 years later, Professor Bell said, quote, "The great crusade to desegregate the public schools has faltered. There is increasing opposition to desegregation at both local and national levels, not all of which can be simply condemned as racist. While the once vigorous support of federal courts is on the decline, new barriers have arisen. Inflation makes the attainment of racial balance more expensive. The growth of Black populations in urban areas renders it more difficult. And increasing numbers of social science studies question the validity of its educational assumptions. Civil rights lawyers dismiss these new obstacles as legally irrelevant. Having achieved so much by courageous persistence, they have not wavered in their determination to implement Brown using racial balance measures developed in the hard-fought legal battles of the last 2 decades. This stance involves great risks for clients whose educational interests may no longer accord with the integration ideals of their attorneys. Now that traditional racial balance remedies are becoming increasingly difficult to achieve or maintain, there is tardy concern that racial balance may not be the relief actually desired by the victims of segregated schools." So what did Professor Bell argue was the relief actually desired by victims of segregated schools? He argued that it was school quality, not desegregation, that was the primary desire of parents as early as 1976. Later on, Professor Bell would engage in a very interesting exercise of writing fictional Supreme Court opinions, wherein he used his imagination to create for himself the ideal Brown decision. And in that ideal Brown decision, as opposed to ordering only desegregation, Professor Bell argued for what he called equalization. In Professor Bell's imaginary Brown decision, he argued that, quote, "Effective immediately," this is what Justice Derek Bell would have said, "effective immediately on receipt of this court's mandate, lower courts will order school officials of the respondent school districts to take the following actions. 1, ascertain through appropriate measures the academic standing of each school district as compared to nationwide norms for school systems of comparable size and financial resources. These data, gathered under the direction and supervision of the district courts, will be published and made available to all patrons of the district, white as well as Black. And 2, all schools within the district must be fully equalized in resources, physical facilities, teacher-pupil ratios, teacher training, experience, and salary, with the goal of each district as a whole measuring up to national norms within 3 years. School districts will report progress to the court annually." So Professor Bell's argument was for an equalization of resources as opposed to desegregation as a more accurate vision of what parents desired in 1976. What I wanted to do was ask ourselves today in 2009, what would this argument look like? What would it look like to argue that in light of the failures of desegregation, we needed to find a way to equalize resources? What I want to pull up for you is a statistic which is pretty jarring. Today, and this is according to an organization called EdBuild, which has engaged in numerous studies analyzing disparate resources based on race throughout the country. Today, non-white school districts get $23 billion with a B less than white school districts, despite serving the same number of students. $23 billion in terms of the financial gap. That is $23 billion which goes towards school counselors, $23 billion which goes towards technology, $23 billion which goes towards field trips $23 billion that goes towards test preparation, including SAT prep, $23 billion which continues to give certain people a leg up while putting people in non-white school districts, children, in a less advantageous position. So how in the world can we bridge that gap under current legal and political conditions? One thing that I want to raise, and I hope we talk about this more over the course of the discussion, is the obsession with localization that continues to rule the day in education circles, and whether or not that is going to forever be a barrier to the accomplishment of equal access to resources. We know that in many districts, the local tax base will dictate in many respects the amount of resources that each school receives. This is in spite of efforts on the state level to use state constitutions in places like New York and California and New Jersey to try to force some sort of equalization of resources. In spite of that litigation, the law has not proved to be an answer, because in spite of these constitutional efforts, we have this $23 billion figure staring right in our face. So my argument actually is for us to reorient ourselves from a constitutional litigation approach to an approach which is very controversial, but also I believe the right one, which is a reparations approach. We know that you can snap if you want to. It's a snap to that. We know that in recent months, we've seen Georgetown University students vote for a reparations package, in many ways to the shame of the administration, which failed to provide reparations after it was discovered that 272 of the people that the Jesuits owned were sold by the Jesuits in order to found Georgetown University. We saw overwhelming support by that student body, and also more and more discussions in other universities where students are interested in taking similar votes. We've seen presidential candidates across the Democratic Party be willing to engage in discussions concerning reparations. Many of those candidates hold high offices already, whether it's in the Senate or on the state level. Those candidates who have come forward arguing for reparations, if they don't win, I believe should continue to be pushed on their reparations position on the local level. And of course, we have seen what I believe to be the most promising effort actually internationally, where the University of West Indies actually did receive $300 million in reparations from a university in Ireland. And I do believe education is going to be the frontier where the reparations discussion begins. In 2006, Professor Verna Williams wrote a law review article in the Michigan Journal of Race and Law discussing an initiative called the Brown Fund Act in an article called Reading, Writing, and Reparations, which I would highly recommend to you, in the Michigan Journal of Race and Law. In this article, she describes how in 2006, the Virginia State Legislature did an analysis and acknowledged that between 1954 and 1963, during the prime years of interposition, when Virginia schools actually shut down in order to avoid desegregation, those students were harmed irrevocably, and there was a need for reparation for the harm done to those students. And so what she described in her article was the process through which this legislative body came to the realization that reparations was not a political third rail, that reparations was deserved, and that process was a process of education. That process was a process of understanding history. and learning specifically what harms had accrued during this time period that justified the need for reparation. And so if you were to take this experiment, so to speak, in Virginia and were to apply it in other jurisdictions nationwide, I don't believe you'd have to go all the way back to 1954. If we look at this study in more depth here from Ed Build, you'll see that today we have a continued racial concentration of resources over a half century after integration efforts. In many white districts, they have smaller student bodies as opposed to non-white districts, yet resources are still concentrated in those districts disproportionately. And we also have laws on the books, which in many states around the country, making it easier for wealthy jurisdictions to break off from larger districts so that they can concentrate their resources even further. We know that even when you limit your analysis between poor white and poor non-white districts, there's still a huge gap in average revenue. And you're free to look up these resources yourself if you go to edbuild.org. It's a wonderful website. And you'll see that poor white school districts receive about 150 less per student than the national average, an injustice all to itself, yet they are still receiving nearly 1,500 more than poor non-white school districts. That's today. And the information continues to boggle the mind in terms of the disparity in resources that is continuing to plague school districts today. So I'm out of time, but I do want to say that all of this is very personal. All of us is personal to me as well. I was born in the Washington, D.C. area, attended public schools all of my life. I found myself in a little bit of trouble. I was a mischievous kid in public schools in Washington, D.C. I ended up moving to live with my grandmother when I was 15 in suburban Maryland, in a place called Olney, Maryland, which a predominantly white area with much higher funding. Ended up going from basically a C student to an A student, was able to find a way to get a good GPA and go to college, and ended up becoming a law professor when beforehand I wasn't necessarily on track to even get into college. But I do know that there were many people at my first public school who were more intelligent than I was, who probably could have accomplished even more than me if they had the resources or a grandmother that they could go move in with in a school district with the resources to provide counseling, to provide expert teaching, to provide more books, more resources. So I do continue to believe that today in 2019, this gap in resources is having truly, I believe, egregious effects. And I think that that is the way that we ultimately provide equity in our public schools, by equalizing resources. So thank you.
Can we hear from you, Barbara Fields? Yeah.
All right. Misery loves company, right? We'll both sit here. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My comments are pretty localized. Boston, I know. I went to school, Boston Public Schools. My first job was in Boston Public Schools. I retired from Boston Public Schools, and so that's part of my DNA, Boston Public Schools. So what I want to do is I want to just go back a little bit. And so I want to go back as far as 1787, when Prince Hall petitions the Massachusetts legislature for African-American access to the public school system, to 1830 through 1855, during which time Boston became embroiled in controversy over school desegregation as Benjamin Roberts sued the city when his daughter Sarah was denied entrance to 5 public schools that stood between their home and the Smith School. And that was a school constructed for Black students from some funds donated from Mr. Smith. 2, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, to Morgan versus Hennigan in 1974. Black students, Black parents, over this period and beyond that, have utilized all avenues available to them, seeking one critical result: an equal opportunity to a quality education for Black children. I have skipped over many landmark events for the sake of time, but Black parents and the Black community have been engaged in constant struggles to remove racist barriers while simultaneously creating opportunities to secure an education for Black children. Included among these efforts during the 60s were the founding of community schools in the Black community, Operation Exodus, and the MECO program that bused Black children to suburban schools. That program continues today, serving not only Black students, but other students of color. Now, in reflecting on Morgan versus Hennigan, commonly referred to in the circles that I travel as the Garrity Deseg case, I am reminded of my own journey as a teacher and administrator in the Boston Public Schools. I was permanently appointed as a first grade teacher in 1974 when Judge W. Arthur Garrity issued some of his first orders. He had found that there was discrimination against Black children, of course, in BPS. Among his many orders to remedy his finding was the hiring of Black teachers. He ordered that every Black teacher who had taken the teacher's exam and was then just sitting on this approved list immediately receive a permanent appointment to a teaching position in the district. Thus began my career in Boston Public Schools. I later became the head of the Office of Equity, reporting to the superintendent. I worked for 10 of them over a period of time, with the responsibility of monitoring the implementation of the staff desegregation order of the court. In this capacity for 25 years, I attended the court sessions and gained an understanding of the intent and the spirit of the court order. Sitting in these sessions also allowed me to hear firsthand the requests, the concerns, the desires, and the hopes of the plaintiff class, the parents, for their children. As Garrity ruled from the bench during this time of racial strife, violence, the failure of politicians to stand up for justice, rocks and bottles thrown at the buses transporting their children, Black parents and students were steadfast in their quest for educational equality. The Black parents weathered, and the students, the storm for the promise of Morgan, that their children would have equal access to the same quality of education that white students were receiving. To this day, many who were active participants still feel the pain and the trauma of that experience. Over a span of more than 2 decades, the court rendered a total of approximately 400 orders that included student assignment, staff desegregation, exam school admissions, safety, parent and community engagement, vocational education, facilities management, transportation, university and college partnerships, bilingual education, student discipline, capital improvements, allocation of resources, and school funding. These comprehensive remedies to the inequities raised by the plaintiff class were often issued directly from the bench. With the active engagement of the court, all schools became equally accessible to all children, including the highly esteemed exam schools. District and central offices were desegregated. Black and other teachers were hired. Other teachers of color were hired and assigned throughout the district in all schools. And many schools were given magnet themes and programs to enhance their educational offerings to attract an integrated student body. And parents were supported in a structure that enabled them to participate fully in the education of their children. A limitation of the court orders was the lack of a systemic focus on rigor and culture in the instruction and curriculum available in all schools to support the academic achievement of all students, but particularly Black students. In 1990, Judge Garrett withdrew from the case, issuing a final order that Boston Public Schools was enjoined from intentionally or unintentionally resegregating the school district. Notwithstanding this final judgment, the district over many years has slowly dismantled many of the programs and practices that promoted integration, fairness, and equity for all children. This has happened through the adoption of policies and practices such as modification in the student assignment plan, resulting in moving closer to resegregating the district. Re-entrenchment and failure to comply with an outstanding federal court order on the hiring and retention of Black teachers. Disregarding the drastic erosion of Black and Latinx students entering and attending the exam schools, promoting a disproportionate closing of schools in communities of color, and underfunding public education, resulting in under-resourced schools that are unable to meet the needs of the student population. Another limitation of the order was that there is no way to impose the will within individuals to value all children in the absence of a court supervision and to eradicate the racism that existed then and now. Today, various laws and ill-conceived accountability initiative passed on the state and national levels mandating excessive high-stakes testing, closing, consolidating schools, causing the disruption and displacement of students and staffs have also negatively impacted the promises inherent in Brown and Morgan. The promises could and should have been fulfilled for those who struggled so hard and invested the safety and lives of their children to realize them. The promises of Brown and Morgan will be accomplished only when there is a political will to do so, and when all children are valued for their brilliance, potential, individual abilities, and gifts. And we must continue to speak up and act to make this happen. As Dr. King stated, human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. As our theme says, we cannot afford to retire, not now.
So I wanted to remain seated so I could sit between Barbara and Susan, which is an honor to be able to do. I wanted to sort of bring us to some of what's happening in the present. And in some ways, the story of Boston clearly has its parallels around the country, right? Very long-standing desegregation cases, intractable issues in many of them. And so I would often get asked when I was at the Legal Defense Fund and at the Justice Department, like, people would be totally, it was unfathomable to them that we would still have these desegregation cases in place. And so I want to give a particular sense of those cases, which is there's an idea that we had this experiment of just desegregating schools in America, and then it didn't quite work, and now we're in a process of resegregation. And the school districts that are part of those 200 desegregation cases, and frankly, hundreds more that for a variety of reasons came out of consent decrees, are often stories where there wasn't a first chance at desegregation at all. And so when I'm thinking about cases that we litigated during my time at the Justice Department in Cleveland, Mississippi, for example, where you can't write it better. There's a railroad track, and there's one high school on one end and another high school on the other, and they've never been anything other than segregated, and there are significant differences between those two high schools. And so the question of how it is that you actually bring that school district together after a history of never actually achieving a modicum of integration is a story of a lot of the cases that we worked on. Those are cases in which I've seen situations around the country that one should never have to see, right? A 95-degree heat where you're seeing students being educated in trailers with, mice and snakes underneath them, right? And you can see it, and I'm not one to like either of those things. And so when I think about anywhere from Tucson, Arizona to the Delta, and so that's the reality of so many of our school district cases that we continue to work on. The reality is also that it's pretty difficult to even conceive of what desegregation means for some of those school districts because they are 85% Black or 90% Black. And so how do you actually really think about what that constitutes today? So the reason I said I wanted to bring it to the present is because I'm happy to talk about those cases and what we've learned from them and what we learned were the kinds of issues that I'm not sure desegregation was ever a tool that could bluntly address what was going on in schools. What I will say is that the debate that has raged on since 1954, that did not sound good, between whether we should have gone down a path of desegregation or whether we should have gone down a path of trying to really equalize resources, the separate but equal question, right? So I think we're in a place in America where we've gotten to a moment of worse than Plessy, which is separate and unequal, and so we haven't had a new desegregation case since the 1990s, and as many of you know, and Gary Orfield, who has written about this for so long, has written another report out today. We're looking at a situation in which the peak of desegregation happened a long time ago, when I was a child, and we've sort of resegregated since. What does that mean? So for me, when I think about what we're trying to combat and address in America today, when I think about hate, hate is born of segregation. And so I'll use a really small example, but one that had ramifications for how we think about ourselves and around the country, which is the question of what happened with Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, both of whom were in Sanford, Florida. Sanford, Florida was part of a longstanding desegregation case. It ended, and those schools rapidly resegregated. And it begs the question of how that might have played out differently had they ever encountered each other or people like each other before that fateful day, right? I'm not saying it would have changed George Zimmerman's behavior in any way. I don't think much will. But I do think about all of these encounters that we're having between people who have yet to see each other, to be able to respect each other, to be able to find a way in which to embrace common ground, right? And so when we think about the rash of hate and how it's been mapped around America, unfortunately, we see it in places, we've seen recent studies about where rallies are happening by the president currently and how hate is sparked in those places, but we also see it mapped onto where we see segregated communities around the country. I am not suggesting in any way that we don't see hate in places like Brooklyn or the suburbs of DC where Justin was growing up and that are, more integrated places in many ways. We see hate there too. But I do want to suggest that part of what's happening is in the separation of America. It's a separation and an inability to see each other that we should be deeply worried about. The other thing that, the other way in which that plays out for in many ways right now is work that Matt and so many in this room have dedicated a lot of their time to, which is looking at the school-to-prison pipeline. And I think of the school-to-prison pipeline as the modern form of segregation. And here's why, which is we are taking students of color and students with disabilities out of educational institutions, out of classes, out of schools, out of educational environments, and placing them outside of school. We're excluding them at record numbers. And so in a situation where the Council of State Governments in Texas issued a report in which 60% of students had been suspended or expelled at least once, you think about what those numbers are. Like, I remember everyone who was suspended when I was a kid, right? I remember why they were suspended, because it wasn't something that happened all that often. But what we're doing in terms of students of color and students with disabilities is really excluding them and segregating them out of an education. And we're doing that through other means. And so school discipline is critical among that. And I want to just take a moment to talk about how that plays out, both in terms of the school discipline piece, but also in terms of hate as well, which is, I was part of the DOJ team that was in Ferguson, where Justin and so many were doing work on the ground. And when I got there, I had all these little kids who were coming up to me and being like, they assassinated my hero. And I didn't know who they were talking about. And I found out within, 2 hours of being there that they were talking about a man named Art McCoy, who was the superintendent of schools in Ferguson. He was the first African-American superintendent in that area. And Art McCoy had, in April, so 4 months before Mike Brown was killed, he had been pushed out by an all-white school board. And there were 2,000 people who showed up at that school board meeting. And when children look at a situation in which those who are like them are pushed out of places of authority or being able to actually invest in them, and Art spent a lot of time in the schools with little boys and little girls who look like him. It is another way in which we see that, and the fact that, look, in Ferguson Middle School, there were 50 kids who were arrested from school, middle school. So you ask them why, and it's another way in which the answer incredibly was they thought that they needed some counseling, and arresting them was a way to get them counseling. But most of those kids, if not all of them, were students of color. And so I think about places like that where you see that kind of violence and that kind of disengagement. And what leads up to a moment of violence is the kind of segregation and closing off of opportunities visually and in a way that you can feel. The other way we're seeing it often is with students with disabilities. And the reason I raise that is because in a place like Georgia, we had a statewide case in Georgia around the segregation out of students with disabilities who were named to have had emotional disturbances. And so what that meant was, like, they had a temper tantrum in class, and across the state of Georgia, like, there's some school districts, nobody was being segregated out for that reason. And then some where lots of students were. You can probably imagine which school districts were which, right? And when I think about that, I think about the fact that those students who were being segregated out were being placed in those old black schools that had been segregated before. Like, they were literally repurposing them to put students with disabilities, which happened to, of course, be a lot of students of color in Georgia. And so, again, this, like, different ways in which we are continuing to segregate students out around the country. I want to say at the outset, there are a lot of ways in which I support many different ways in which we can help students of color, and that includes things that for some might be unpopular, like charter schools and vouchers and many other things. But the reason why I think we should look at all of those possible options, there are places where it has been a disaster. Louisiana is a place where it will break your heart over and over again, and I think about the Louisiana voucher system, which was something that was put in place by then Governor Bobby Jindal. And part of what was happening was kids who were in failing schools were being literally sent to places where there were 100 kids in a classroom watching a DVD with no teacher, right? And that's not providing an avenue towards opportunity. That's providing another way in which kids are being segregated out. And so we have to really be mindful of the fact that, like, pathways to opportunity don't become pathways to segregation again, right? And then I want to go back to unfortunately the ways in which those communities around this country who learned from Brown, who learned from the time of Brown in those first 35 years, in those first 40 years, a place like Louisville, Kentucky, which I've spent a lot of time in with many people here, that said to everybody, hey, you know what, we learned what it meant to have a segregated community, and we want to actually promote diversity in our schools. That's something that we in upwards of 85% of white and black and parents of all different racial backgrounds supported that they were getting stopped from doing that. And that's in the Supreme Court case of parents involved in community schools versus Seattle School District in 2007. And the reason I raise that, I mean, I remember we spent a lot of time trying to document not only the benefits, again, of diversity, but also the kind of ways in which people had learned and the ways in which communities had come together. And Louisville was, to me, an example of that. Charlottesville, with all of the hate that it experienced, to me, in some ways, the way in which a community came together to fight hate in Charlottesville is an example of that, right? So we have to look at the ways in which that also is being stopped as a way in which we continue to perpetuate segregation. And so I want to read, because I used to have it memorized and I don't anymore, but I want to read one passage from Justice Breyer's dissent in Parents Involved. I know it is familiar to many of you in the room. I know that Professor Ogletree was sitting in the front row when this was read, along with his old fishing buddy, John Payton, and Ted Shaw. And the reason I want to read it is because this was the longest dissent that Justice Breyer has ever written. And this is the last part of it, right, which is appropriate, I think, for today. Finally, what of the hope and promise of Brown? For much of this nation's history, the races remained divided. It was not long ago that people of different races drank from separate fountains, rode on separate buses, and studied in separate schools. In this court's finest hour, Brown versus Board of Education challenged this history and helped to change it. For Brown held out a promise. It was a promise embodied in 3 amendments designed to make citizens of slaves. It was a promise of true racial equality, not as a matter of fine words on paper, but as a matter of everyday life in the nation's cities and schools. It was about the nature of a democracy that must work for all Americans. It sought one law, one nation, one people, not simply as a matter of legal principle, but in terms of how we actually live. Not everyone welcomed this court's decision in Brown. 3 years after that decision was handed down, the governor of Arkansas ordered state militia to block the doors of a white schoolhouse so that black children could not enter. The President of the United States dispatched the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock, Arkansas, and federal troops were needed to enforce a desegregation decree. Today, almost 50 years later, attitudes towards race in this nation have changed dramatically. Many parents, white and black alike, want their children to attend schools with children of different races. Indeed, the very school districts that once spurned integration now strive for it. The long history of their efforts reveals the complexity and difficulties they have faced. And in light of those challenges, they have asked us not to take from their hands the very instruments they have used to rid their schools of racial segregation, instruments that they believed are needed to overcome the problems of cities divided by race and poverty. The plurality would decline their modest request. This is a decision that the court and the nation will come to regret. 5 years ago, on the 60th anniversary of Brown, tomorrow, I was at the White House, and we had a celebration of Brown with the President of the United States, with an Attorney General, and with many, many people, including the families of all of those who were involved in the multiple cases around Brown versus Board of Education, and Thurgood Marshall's wife herself. And the reason I raise that is because I'm reflecting on it today, 5 years later, and where we're at. And not only are we at that in terms of the ways in which we even might mark Brown, I mean, we are literally confirming judges to federal courts every day who don't believe that Brown is good law or that it should have been decided the way it was. And so in light of that, I promised myself I wouldn't be completely depressing, but here I am being completely depressing. The Department of Education, the secretary now withdrew the guidances that we had put together in the last administration about how we could actually promote diversity in our schools and do it in a way that didn't force people to that place, right? And when asked about that in a recent hearing, she doesn't remember those guidances at all. Like, she doesn't remember having withdrawn them less than a year earlier, right? So she withdrew them in July of this year. That was a month ago. And so I had people sending this to me being like, you're not going to like what you're watching. I just feel like this is a part of the country that this administration wants to forget and not to exist. And so I think it's an important moment for all of us to commemorate and make sure it's a part of our history that we come to celebrate and continue to fight for.
Go up to the thing, because I have to click the thing.
You got it. You clicked the
Do you want us
thing.
to click the thing for you?
Click the thing. All right. So I'm humbled being the last one to speak after these three geniuses here, but I'll do my best. Let's see. So far I'm failing because I can't get the thing to move. Do you know if it's loaded in the? Oh. Yeah, it's perfect, yeah. And so do I just press it like this thing? All right.
Just give it a second.
All right, I'm just gonna give it a second, all right. Okay, so, thanks to everybody. Hi, everybody. In 1962, Martin Luther King addressed a group of teachers in Georgia, Black teachers in Georgia, who were distressed over the fact that the hopes that they had for Brown v. Board of Education did not look like they were being realized, in large part because many of them had lost their jobs. And Martin Luther King told this group of teachers, there are many who think of integration merely in aesthetic and romantic terms, where you just add a little color to a still predominantly white power structure. We must see integration in political terms, where there is shared power. And that is how contemporary advocates for integration who are working in communities across the nation have come to understand and think about what integration means today. Integration and desegregation are not synonymous. Desegregation undoes a physical segregation. But the aspiration of integration in the minds of those teachers back in 1962, right, who knew that that their children were experiencing second-class integration is what they called it. The aspiration of integration is far broader. The aspiration is that it is a counterforce to systemic inequality, to white supremacy, to false hierarchies of human value that pollute our minds and our classrooms and our society. So to help make this aspiration a little bit more concrete, I wanted to turn our attention to the youth-led organization called Integrate NYC here, which fights to create and improve integrated schools in New York City. And this group of multiracial middle schoolers and high schoolers who are joined by their teachers and in many cases their parents, their school counselors, point to 5 elements that are integral to real integration. One is race and enrollment. So they ask the question, who's in your school? Do the demographics of your school, do they reflect the region? Do they reflect even the neighborhood? And then they talk to Professor Hansford's point about resources. They say, okay, so you've got a diverse school, but that's nowhere near enough. We want not just equal resources, we want true equity, where the needs of the students in a particular school are deeply understood, where the challenges of a neighborhood or a community are deeply understood, and those resources are provided in a way so that all students can thrive. We focus on relationships. They say that they want schools to foster the ability for young people to build relationships across racial and socioeconomic and ethnic groups, and to actively disrupt racism. These students are calling for things like culturally relevant pedagogy in their schools. They're talking about the need for an elective of ethnic studies because they understand that what their curriculum teaches and the norms that exist in terms of the school will help foster those relationships across racial lines that are very important to the young people. Restorative justice, the kinds of things that Anarima talked about, the need for schools to be free of medical detectors, for fair discipline policies, representation of the school faculty to ensure that there's teacher diversity in their schools and that the teachers and the counselors and the leadership in those schools reflect the diversity of those schools. So I have as Matt said, that I've done a lot of writing and research about school desegregation and about segregation across the country. And right now I have kind of an interesting vantage point in which I'm working with funders, philanthropic organizations, people with high net worth, and trying to get them to understand the importance of investing in truly equitable schools. And I also sit on the steering committee of the National Coalition of School Diversity. And so because of those two things, I really need to be aware of what's going on in the larger landscape out there. And so I'm able to see a lot of things that, you know, isn't right out there in the news all the time. And so for that reason, I do have a little bit of hope. And so what I see are two stories, and both of them are true. The first is absolutely that we are in retreat, in exactly the way that Anarima and that Barbara Fields talked about. When we see efforts toward integration take root in some communities, we see often white affluent parents freak out and run away. That is still true. We see fights against affordable housing in more affluent and middle class white communities. We see school districts that draw segregative boundaries or that do nothing in the face of segregation, even though they could change their school boundaries and create more integrated schools. We know that most of the segregation exists not even within school districts, but between school districts. And the city of Boston is a great example of that, where we still have majority white suburbs, and we've got, you know, an urban center there. We know that those patterns of segregation were created because of racial discrimination, and yet we do little to nothing to remedy those kinds of things. So that story is absolutely true. And so I wanted to highlight this report that a couple of people have alluded to, and this report is an excellent report, and it manages to really to summarize the current trends now with relation to segregation by the Civil Rights Project and the Center for Education and Civil Rights. But there's another story that's also true, and I want to take some time to focus on that, because I feel like if we don't focus on the very real possibilities for change, that we're going to get overwhelmed and lose our capacity to actually do something. And this story features protagonists from across the country who are naming segregation as a problem, naming it accurately as the underpinning for racial stratification, and seeking true integration as one solution, and a particular type of integration. In New Jersey, about a year ago, a coalition of civil rights groups representing a multiracial group of parents sued the state, arguing that segregation and its attendant inequalities created unequal educational opportunity in violation of the state constitution. Meanwhile, also in New Jersey, in Morristown and in Montclair, those two school districts remain committed to an imperfect, as always, integrated system created through magnet schools and through school boundary adjustments. Recently, just last month in Trenton, New Jersey, a multiracial group of parents and educators stood up against plans to segregate English language learners in separate educational settings. And I would love it if someone would volunteer to read this quote out loud. This is from Elise Body, a longtime colleague of many of ours, and I'm a big fan. And she was the leading attorney in that New Jersey case, and I think that this quote really sums up why the fight against segregation still remains important today. Read it, anyone. Go ahead, thank you.
The problem with segregation is that it makes us more likely to assume that people are a certain way, to stereotype how they think and who they are. You often don't get a chance to know someone from a different racial background. So you never get to learn why all those things you think you know are actually wrong. Separate will never be equal, because when you segregate people, as we do when we rely on residential borders to decide where a child goes to school, you draw a fence around them. You isolate them from power, from resources, from wealth. Segregation separates people from opportunity.
You should be in radio. I don't know who you are, but you should be in radio. Yeah. Nice, and this is the recent protest in Trenton, New Jersey. Okay, so, whoops, sorry, I'm not supposed to go to the slides. Okay, so so I want to go through a few other places to give you a sense of what's happening kind of around the country, and maybe we can have a conversation about that later. So we had New York, we had New Jersey. In Denver, Colorado, the school district itself recently appointed a panel to develop recommendations that would reduce and prevent segregation and displacement amid rapid demographic change in that city. And implementation, as you might have guessed, just like with Brown, has been quite slow. But it's important to note that the committee members have become very persistent advocates, and the recommendations really provide a very thoughtful blueprint and homegrown blueprint for policy and practice around which to advocate. I just spoke with a group of funders there who are also really interested in investing in the work that they've done. We talked a little bit about New York City. The students who I was talking about, Integrate New York NYC, they've worked in collaborations with organizations like Appleseed New York, the New York City and Alliance for School Integration and Desegregation, who've really forced the problems of segregation, but also of curricular tracking, of unequal curriculum, and of barriers to admission for students of color in the exclusive high schools onto many political agendas, and they are seeing real movement on these issues. They've won the support of the chancellor and some key elected officials as well. And we've also seen in District 3 and 15 in New York City, recently we saw a diverse group of parents who were upset about the levels of segregation in their school districts in Manhattan and in Brooklyn, taking matters into their own hands. They managed to set new enrollment rules, they got rid of screenings for middle school admissions, and began educating each other about school options, and this has indeed resulted in more diverse schools this year. In New Orleans, Louisiana, whoops, I've got my slides all messed up here, right? That's not the right thing. In New Orleans, Louisiana, soon after Hurricane Katrina, many of you may know that that district was turned into a whole charter district. Well, there was a group of parents who foresaw that that really could really carried the risk of further segregating an already very segregated district. So a group of parents, local residents, and young people who had attended the Morris Jeff Community School worked together to create their own school with the intention of making it racially and economically diverse in a way that perfectly reflected the neighborhood. They also, even as a charter, they sort of became like the anti-charter charter. So they're one of the few charter schools in New Orleans that actually has a teachers union as well. The school is very popular and has shown great results for students of all racial and economic backgrounds. In Minnesota, recently, a multiracial group of parents a couple of years ago sued the state, again arguing, similar to New Jersey, that school district borders drawn coterminously with racial discriminatory housing practice, along with other school assignment mechanisms, created unequal, inadequate educational opportunities for students in violation of the state constitution. In Austin, Texas, the small group, Austin for Integrated Schools, is an advocacy group of a multiracial group of parents and young people and educators. They've designed and proposed comprehensive homegrown plans for school integration and have successfully forced the topic onto the school board agenda again as well. In the DC region, the parent-led Live Together, Learn Together organization advocates for policies at the local and national level that create incentives for school diversity and that advance racial equity and community building across racial and socioeconomic lines in diverse schools. In more than 24 rural, suburban, and urban schools in Utah, yes, in Utah, students attend schools where they learn in both English and Spanish. And these so-called two-way immersion schools started off as a way, because educational leaders and economic development leaders saw that bringing multilingualism and promoting multilingualism would be something that would help the economic development of the state. But since these schools have come into being, they've realized that they have also ended the very harmful, ineffective, and unequal practice of segregating English language learners during a time of rapid demographic change in this state, and that many of these two-way bilingual schools, especially in changing rural communities, have really become centers of community building. In Los Angeles, a mother of two named Courtney Everts McKitten has built a small but very rapidly expanding national community of parents across the country who have chosen to send their white kids to school where children of color are in the majority. This organization offers guidance to help white parents foster anti-racist school practice and advocate for equity. They also have a really great podcast. And I know, Justin, they are looking for you to be on that, so just FYI. So sometimes when we look at this problem of segregation, if we do indeed see it as a problem, as really overwhelming. But I can say that in the 2 decades or more that I've been engaged in this work, I do see a growing demand at a lot of local levels in a lot of places that you wouldn't expect all across the country. There's a growing willingness to really name segregation as a problem. And now I see it as really important for government and also for philanthropy, which also gets left out of this conversation, to support both the more established efforts, like the METCO program here in Boston, which has been running since 1965, and also along with these more fledgling efforts as well that exist all across the country. And I wanted to hold up Rucker Johnson's book there in final. Fabulous book so far. I haven't finished it. But one of the arguments that Rucker Johnson makes is that he shows the benefits generationally, especially for African-American kids over time, of desegregated schooling. But the ultimate argument that he makes in the book is that integration did have huge benefits, but to really see a difference in terms of not just closing the achievement gap, but closing the inequality gap, it's necessary to have, as Professor Hansford said, equitable school funding, particular types of school practices, and also investments in preschool and in health. So I think it's important to not consider integration just in isolation, but in how, what are the other things that need to support integration so that we can harness the potential benefits of it. So.
There are a lot of places we can go now. And as I said at the outset, what we want in these last 45 minutes that we have together, first is for our panelists to be questioning each other, and then to make time so that we're all engaging in dialogue. And each time I look up, I see more folks with more years of experience doing this work and doing it from all sorts of invaluable perspectives. So the sooner I shut up, the better. But I'm going to start us with one question, maybe, and I'm just going to leave this open. But just to put it out there, I want to know from your perspectives how anticipated white flight was as a response to Brown and as a response to Morgan v. Hennigan here in Boston. It seems stunning that neighborhoods where white families had lived for generations, including those that they'd guarded with racially restricted covenants or by the use of the Klan itself, were abandoned in the face of desegregated schooling wholesale. And I want to know what that says about the self-concept of those who left. And I also want to know what it means for the notion of education as the very foundation of good citizenship that David alluded to from Justice Warren's Brown opinion. Right? So I'm gonna bring that open to everybody, but unless I see somebody jump, I'm gonna start calling for volunteers.
Or a different question for your panelists.
There you go. That's right.
Either way.
Susan, do you want, all right.
She's questioning.
This is my questioning, yeah. So of course, Matt's gonna ask one of the hardest questions there is out there for the history of this work, but also for us today. The question of our, of the ways in which people want to separate themselves or to go back to some different time is I think, so much of what is underlying white supremacy, oppression. So much of that is what's underlying some of what we're seeing around the country. And I would say this, which is, what we know from all of these decades is that, sort of left to people's own devices, if they're able to to take a choice, right? People don't necessarily choose an option to go to school or to be in a community or to live next to someone who is different from them. And so there's some ways, and that doesn't mean, I'm talking about in the first instance, I think that there are lots of stories of where, over time, when people have been in those communities, they've wanted to stay in those communities. And so the question is, how do we get there to begin with? And that's why I think it's really dangerous, one, that we're taking away the ability of so many who want to make that choice to make that choice. And then secondly, that, that we're literally creating situations in which we continue to ascribe to one race or another certain opportunities, and so and certain resources, right? And so when that maps the way it does, it's hard to blame people to make choices, that they think are better for their kids and their family. And so both of those things are at play.
I also think the whole issue of power and control tied in with race is something we can't lose sight of. When I look at what happens in Boston public schools, it seems that when efforts are made, the work is done to try to bring all schools up, that there's almost a mean-spiritedness about giving to the children who don't have, even when it does not take away from those who do have. I think of one school in particular that can give a fundraiser, and they can raise $50,000, with one fundraiser because of the economics of the families that attend that school. And it's a larger white population than the other schools. Whereas if you go to a school in Mattapan, they do a fundraiser, and they're lucky if they raise $3,000. When we talk about accessing, let's say, the exam schools, then all of a sudden you can't do that because you're lowering the standards. There's always a negativism tied into the issue of trying to raise up children and give them the resources that they need. I think of the power and control. You mentioned the charter schools. And my thing with charter schools is that I don't think we'll get Malcolm X's and Harriet Tubman's and those kind of folk out of charter schools, because it seems to me, from the folk in my family who have gone to charter schools, that there's more of a abide by the rules, don't challenge authority, critical thinking. You do what you're told when you're told to do it. I don't see the value placed in the fact of being able to think for yourself and challenge authority in a respectful way. I don't mean it in a negative way. But then I wonder what happens when you move out of that setting. What is going to happen with the children who go to those schools? And to survive there, you must follow the rules, no excuses. So I have had 4 of my nieces and nephews who've gone to charter schools. One came out of the charter school, she's doing well, but she's a totally different personality. She's very compliant, she's very quiet. You tell me what to do and I'll do it when you tell me to do it. And then I have Black males in my family who operate in a different way. So I think there's a lot that we need to do to peel back the onion in terms of just the education that our kids are getting wherever they are. We look in Boston and we can see that with the testing, that we use that in a way to disrupt instruction, disrupt the schools, and then we close them because you're not doing well, and we push those kids off to someplace else. And then we come for you later, because now we've clustered the kids who are not doing well in a school, and those are often the special needs kids, the English language learners, the low-income kids, and we don't give them the resources. So sometimes I wonder if it's set up that way just for power and control versus empowering people, versus having folk do their best. What is this bigger picture? And now when I look at where we're going as a country, then I begin to think, well, wait a minute, maybe I'm not crazy after all. And maybe one place we're starting is in our schoolhouses with our children, because you can see the same things happening in the schools that we see in the larger, society. So I don't know if I answered the question, but that's kind of where I am at with this.
Yeah, actually, we thought of a blog post that I pulled up that I thought really spoke to your question. There was this is on educationpost.org, but there was a teacher who had been having a discussion with another teacher, and they were talking about this teacher's particular experience. And I just want to read it to you because I think it does speak to your question pretty directly. They were talking about how things were going in this new school district, and the narrator was describing the discussion with this other teacher. The other teacher said, quote, "Well, the taxes in my district are extremely high, so we have incredible schools with incredible kids. The parents expect us to deliver results. We do or we're fired. We have very high test scores and our kids do very well," unquote. And then the narrator goes on to say, "It bothered me to hear her, the other teacher, nonchalantly propagate the belief that wealthy schools are inherently better than impoverished schools. She said it with total acceptance of the status quo, insinuating that she had won some kind of educational lottery because she worked in such a well-to-do district. Naturally, I began to dissect her statements, engaging in a weird act of triage to rank the most offensive of her comments to least offensive. Let's unpack the assumption that wealthy communities must have better schools. To be clear, I don't blame her for loving her job. Teachers in affluent districts aren't the enemy, but both her actual words and the implications of her statements astounded me. Let's unpack those implications for a minute. Here's what I saw implied by what she said. 1, wealthy parents have earned the privilege to harbor high expectations for their children's schools. 2, parents who can't afford to live in upper-class neighborhoods should inherently expect less from their children's schools. 3, children in affluent communities deserve high-quality education, which yields measurable progress. 4, children in impoverished communities are less deserving of high-quality education. 5, teachers should be grateful to work in affluent communities because they have quote-unquote incredible kids. And 6, low-income schools are intrinsically predisposed to have kids that are, well, not quote-unquote incredible. This last statement especially set off my alarm bells. I have no doubt that the test scores are high, considering that most of the students' basic needs are being met in the well-resourced schools. But eventually, I gave up dissecting her comments and ordered a second glass of wine. But I think this, it speaks to your quote, Matt, because I think that there's a sense of feeling that you deserve a sense of desert in some communities for certain levels of education for their children. And there's a belief that other children don't deserve equal amounts of resources. It tracks to wealth and it tracks to race. And I think the reason that history is so important is because, and it's a very difficult conversation to have. If you read the Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, people can begin to understand how wealth is generated in America. Wealth is not generated through desert or merit. Wealth is generated through historical inequality that was passed down through, in some cases, real estate, other types of equity. And so there are wide disparities in terms of the resources available in different school districts. But it's not because the parents in one school district deserve better schools for their kids than the parents in the other school districts. I think right now parents believe that they deserve better schools for their kids based on the place where they live and the wealth that they may have accumulated or inherited. And I think it's a very difficult question to ask how we're going to solve that without a process of mass education, because as long as people believe in the concept of merit so wholeheartedly, they believe that they have earned the right to give their kids more than other parents have earned the right to give their kids. And so the project of public schools is a project, if there's going to be true equality in public schools, is a project that would seem to cut against that, wherein everybody deserves equity and equality regardless of the quote-unquote merit or desert of the parent. I don't think most people in our society really have that level of consciousness or understanding yet. So I think that's really the root of the problem.
Yeah, I think one important part of this, too, is how we measure schools and how we rank schools, right, based on things like test scores. And then that feeds into this narrative, right, that you're talking about, right, and that, Barbara, that you were alluding to. So it's like you have this case where, like, these kids are doing well on test scores for a whole host of reasons that have nothing to do with school quality even necessarily, or their intelligence. And then that makes the case that that's a bad school, and then we have to close that school. So I think what's also is we have to, I think another thing that's really important, not just in the fight for, integration, but for equity, is how we think about school quality, right? We look at a really narrow measure, and that's how we judge and rank schools. And there's an effort here, and in other places of the country too, but an especially compelling one here, started by Jack Schneider, who was a professor. He's a professor of education at the University of Lowell. And it's the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment. And one of the things he's doing, he's got 7 very different, demographically different school districts. And they're designing measures of school quality based on community input, by observations, by a whole host of things that track very similarly to the way that the Integrate NYC young people talk about what really matters in a school. Community, can we build relationships? Do we feel seen? Do students have an opportunity to pursue their interests? Is there cultural and is there racial diversity in the school? A whole host of different factors go into that. And I think that that's a really important and also kind of forgotten element of how school inequality and these narratives about not just who's deserving, but also what's a good school get perpetuated.
I know there's other questions, but let me just say 2 things, which I thought, I was trying to get Susan to say, which is one, just think about what's announced today, right? Which is, there's a merit-based system of immigration to America, right? And so somehow or another, we're gonna privilege skilledness over families coming together, and how to even sort of put that out there in terms of what merit actually means in America today. I think about that as one of the many ways in which we have to think about these questions in their context right now. The other thing I would say is, for those of you who didn't know, the College Board announced today that it would have an adversity score that would be taken into account with regards to your SAT. And there's 15 factors that go into the adversity score. And so I started looking into it this afternoon and was talking about it, but I think it's an interesting way in which to think about what's packed into the SAT and what it reflects really in terms of the kind of opportunities that students have to be able to prepare and get paid many things to be able to take the SAT. It also is a way in which we think about community level obstacles, and when you talk to people in admissions, they will tell you all the time, what they're looking for is the students who've been able to persevere over obstacles, and this is one way in which you can think about some of that. And so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
So I think we're going to turn to the audience in a second, but I did have one question that I wanted to kind of pose, and because I need some help on something here. And it kind of goes back to Justin's opening. And I want to say I really appreciated especially the examples that Susan gave of things that are happening around the country, because like Annie Rima, I kind of worry about being Davy Downer, and I think we're determined to be up a bit. But Susan, in the quote that was so beautifully and eloquently read, there was a phrase that I wrote down: segregation separates people from opportunity. And, it's interesting because I think the examples you were talking about didn't convey that. But I want to unpack, that's troublesome, right? I mean, because that means that Justin had to go to Olney to get access to opportunity. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is if that's a natural phenomenon, that segregation naturally separates people from opportunity, or that's a reflection of the reality of kind of inequality in this country, right? So I'm not sure, so what's your sense of that, Susan, in terms of the relationship between segregation?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So one of the things that I have always said is that it's not about that segregation segregates children of color from white people, but it segregates people from opportunity. And it's exactly as you said, because of the structure of inequality in our society, because of the history and contemporary forms of racial discrimination that have created housing segregation, that have created a disinvestment in many communities of color across the nation, that have created a disinvestment in public schools, the whole host of things that have happened. Yes, the way that opportunity is structured now is that when you cut people off and isolate them, then there are not opportunities to enter into environments where you may perceive that there is opportunity there, absolutely. That doesn't mean that within communities of color, you can't create opportunities. Absolutely, but there's a both and kind of thing that I would advocate for. So the ability to seek opportunity wherever it may lie because of the structure of opportunity as it exists in society today, and then also to invest in communities of color so that people don't necessarily have to leave. I mean, I think the way that I tend to think about it now is that right now, we have a situation where we know we've got, decades of research that's been done about the challenges that exist in high poverty schools for a whole host of reasons. Harder to attract and retain teachers, harder to sustain public investment. A concentration of problems in terms of health inequities that visit themselves upon the schools, a whole host of things, and this has been documented over and over and over again ad nauseum. And we are in a situation right now where millions of children, because of school district borderlines that are drawn along racially discriminated housing patterns, are forced to go to these schools that we know have huge challenges. It's not fair. Yes, they should have more funding. All of those kinds of things are true, but that's the situation that exists now.
Susan, let me just follow up 1 second, because I think there's partly a language thing here, because when we say segregation separates people from opportunity, in Justin's blog, I mean, we need to understand that whites are segregated.
Oh, absolutely. Whites are the most segregated group in our society.
No, my point is they have total access to opportunity.
Right.
So segregation itself doesn't.
Segregation of poor and children of color. Absolutely,
so my only point is I think we need to, as we do this, we need to tease out and complete our sentences.
Yeah.
I mean, and understand what we're saying when we say something like that, because otherwise, I think it might lead us down, it might mislead us a little
Oh,
bit.
absolutely. Whites and Latinos, in terms of children, are the most segregated groups in our society. The segregation levels for African-American kids in schools are rising, but they're not as high as they are for Latinos, especially in the West, and for white students who go to the schools with the highest share of students who look like them. Some of that is because of demographics, but no, it's an arrangement that has been socially constructed. So, yeah, absolutely right.
So, Barbara, did you want to say? I'm sorry.
I guess I keep hearing this and I keep thinking maybe we're not putting the issue of race really on the table. And I think the comment you just made, when you say you can have an all-white community, neighborhood, almost a state, and you can have all kinds of opportunities. So why is it you can have opportunities when whites are segregated, but you can't when people of color are segregated? So I don't know how we get around the issue of race and how race plays, into all of this. And I think unless we kind of acknowledge that, we're really kind of not having a courageous conversation, as Singleton would say. Because, I can look at schools I'm going to use the Timothy School as an example. It was a junior high school in Roxbury, well sought after by all parents across racial lines, with a long waiting list. And that school was paired with Mass General and had all kinds of resources, and extended day and everything. Well, when some of the other schools that white students could attend that became K-8s, and the Timothy was a middle school, so you had the elementaries, they became K-8s, the white students sort of left and went closer to home in some of the K-8 schools. And then you saw the district pull away the extended day, not provide the buses so they could come on a Saturday. And I'll never forget, in a senior staff meeting with the superintendent, those of us who reported to the superintendent, the battle we had about why you're pulling the resources away. Why was this? The program was started by Laval Wilson, and it was his way of making sure the kids had the additional resources. They were there, longer for the school day, on Saturdays and all of that. And it was almost as if, as soon as he left the district, there was a fight to remove it. It was almost as if we don't want this to exist. And I look at so many of our situations within Boston where, and I used the word meanness before, because I couldn't think of a better word at the time, but it's almost a desire to make sure that the kids aren't doing as well as they can do. The biggest fight we had was around this plan to have an achievement gap policy and plan. And that was under Tom Pezant. And we were able to, it was his last day as a superintendent in Boston. And his going away gift was that we had a battle royal about the school committee adopting this policy to deal with then we call it achievement gap. Since that time, we talk about the opportunity gap, one and the same. The opportunity gap creates that achievement gap, lack of opportunity. So that's really what it was. But from that time, and that was 2006, the Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts continued that fight, and it was only up until, what year, Peggy, that we were able to get the school committee to appoint a task force and re-energize the work around the achievement gap. And so it was like, why is the district fighting that so hard? We said we want all children to excel. We're trying to figure out how to do it. And we talked about rigorous instruction. We talked about cultural competency. We talked about the things that Vanessa Sill Walker talks about in that book, that Black teachers did and kids were doing well. Those are the kinds of strategies that need to happen in our schools, but yet there seems to be this resistance to it. So it's like, what is it? And I can't think of anything other than the issues around race and privilege and, you know, those other things that we don't like to talk about. And I think until we do that, we're not really going to get to this issue. And I think we can have integration. I think integration is great, and we need that if we're going to move together as a society. But I do feel very strongly that the parents in Boston, when they brought forth that suit, were not looking for integration. They were looking to access to resources. They want the same things for their children that they saw that white parents had. And when, you know, when they could not get that, that's when they started looking at other places because they had tried everything. And it's like we just need the resources. So I think there are a lot of parents now, and they go to charter schools, they're looking for resources. Some have their kids in MECO, they're looking for the resources. You know, they're not looking for integration. They know there's a value to integration, but they're just looking for fairness in their children having the same opportunities as other children. And that's something we seem to resist for whatever reasons in providing. And until we have those kinds of difficult conversations, like what's under that? You know, can we peel back the onion and figure this out? Because we would all be better off, you know, if we could just figure that out, but we really don't talk about it. And so I remember the fights in council meetings at the school department about all the schools having AP courses and honor courses. Why wasn't it only the exam schools had it and one other school, Snowden? So after a big battle in the council meeting, then we decided every school had to at least have one. One. But Boston Latin must have had 12, 13 AP courses. You know, advanced work classes. You know, why can't the curriculum be advanced for all of the children? Why is it just for some? So those are the kinds of discussions, I think, that must be had if we're really going to benefit from the integration, but at the same time, provide for our parents what they started fighting about in the 1700s, and they're still fighting about it today.
So I think we're going to open it up to questions. If you have a question, please line up at the mic here. And
I'm very interested in finding out where has it worked and how can we replicate that? I don't know if it has.
So there's a fundamental question, right? Which is like, what is it in that sentence, right? Which is
Opportunity for full integration so that, you know, every child is treated with dignity and respect and they're able to thrive and become the valuable asset that everybody is.
So I'm going to diverge for a moment here, which is to say that I'm not sure that full integration in and of itself is going to get you to that place, right?
We'll get us there. I'm so frustrated.
Yeah, well, I think we all share in the frustrations and in different ways are trying to struggle with these same questions of like really at the end of the day, some of the ways in which we put our frustrations, I think, are not all that helpful, right? Which is we debate the ways in which we're going to get to a place of dignity and justice and respect all the time, as opposed to sort of starting on that path and trying to push in multiple different ways to get there, right? So, I mean, the reason I can give you examples of places that have, I would use a Louisville as an example at some point in its, from 1975 to 2000, from like 2004, as an example of a place that had embraced integration. What I would also tell you, because I've decided to be Debbie Downer today, is that that there's within school segregation all over the place, right? Even the places where we've seen, and so I think the question is, right, is the thing I worry about most, and I'll just go back down my Debbie Downer moment, right, which is the ways in which we are now in a time where I feel like we're not in the declining significance of race, we're in the increasing significance of race in the following way, which is we're seeing how it plays out in terms of which lives matter and which educations matter all the time, right? And more importantly, we're seeing, I mean, I'll give the breaking heart moment for me in 2016, December, is a 4-year-old in Brooklyn who says of the president, right? He can't see my heart because he can't see past my skin, right? Now what does that mean for a 4-year-old to think that way, right? So what I would say to you is, I think the reason why I'm saying I'm agnostic, right, on any effort to try and better education for kids is because there are charters who I think do a really good job of serving kids. There are a lot of charters, as we just described, that don't, right? There are a lot of public schools that do and there are public schools that don't. What I want is for there to be a commitment that the people who win are not always the ones we look at who are deciding the power and control over the rest of our lives and our educational systems. And so I don't have I mean, we can talk about this afterwards because there's a long line of questions, but I do think that you're not gonna find a panacea here, because that would be like finding the solution to the hardest question we have, which is how do we build an America for everybody?
Yeah.
I think there are schools that have, I'm thinking more in terms of eliminating the opportunity gap and providing resources in a fair way, having the rigorous curriculum. All of those, and I mean, I could go through them, but all of the things that you need in schools for kids to succeed. There are schools that have done that. And for the life of me, I can't think of it. There's a district that was in New Jersey. And when we were working with the achievement gap within Boston, we talked about going to visit. But it had to do with those things we've been talking about. You know, the resources, the curriculum, kids having a full range, addressing the whole child. You know, art, music, gym, all of those things. And it goes back down to, are we willing to actually fund our schools? And if we don't fund our schools and provide the resources that we need and address the whole child, then we won't get there. And so I know that there are places that have done it. Places that have done it with a large district, no. Schools and pockets within districts. I can show you some places in Boston where we've done it.
So
I'm sorry.
So I just want to answer that there are a lot of examples of places that have a piece of all of these things that we've talked about. But in every single case, you can have like a diverse school that perfectly reflects everything, teacher diversity, curricular tracking, and it is still always going to be a work in progress, which goes back to, I think, the quote that Barbara offered us at the very beginning, which was like, progress isn't made, it's not inevitable. This has to keep working because of the racist country that we live in, because of the structure, because of the ongoing discrimination in our society. That's always going to seep in, it's always going to threaten the school. But I want to go back to this book just really quickly, Children of the Dream, Why School Integration Works by Rucker Johnson. Also happens to, trivia fact, also happens to be the son of Carol Johnson, the former Boston school superintendent. And what he argues is that integration has enormous benefits, and it's shown out over time, over generations, but it's not going to be enough without equal school funding, without serious investments in children and family health, and early childhood education, and mental health, physical health and mental health. Because if we're going to think about schools, we have to look outside of schools, because schools don't exist in a vacuum. So it's not enough to talk about culturally relevant pedagogy or teacher diversity. You have to look at the whole society in which we live and make those investments, and then I think you start to move the needle.
I guess, hi everyone. My question kind of builds on what you just said, because I feel like when I've been thinking about these issues and looking at all the different things people try, what it always seems to come down to me is that it's about the gap, right? The inequality, so that the people with privilege always find a way to maintain that privilege, right? So it goes back to your question at the beginning, Matt, like, okay, well, you have desegregation. Well, white people just pick up and leave. They start segregation academies. And you know, I know a lot of people who don't I know a lot of white parents who don't actually think that they deserve a better education more, but every day they make choices that are best for their kids that mean they get a better education, right? That end up excluding a whole bunch of other kids, right? And I'm sure there's underlying things as well, but they're not actively working on that premise that they deserve more. I'm sure that that is also a very big problem, right? But it's just we have this system where the choices that people make always seem to reinforce that privilege, right? And that's bigger than just education, right? So what are the other kind of systemic changes we need to make that change that? Because otherwise it just feels like any policy we make, people with means are going to find a way around it, right?
It's given that privilege to the other kids too.
But yeah, but I guess how do we give that privilege to the other kids?
If I was someone asked me a question a couple years ago, maybe you were sitting next to me, about like what I would change. I would eliminate private schools. I would literally make everyone go to public schools, because then you don't have, then you have a very different equation of how it is that you invest.
Yeah, you said that in my class at the Harvard Ed School, where at least 3/4 of the kids had gone to private schools, and I thought it was great. Yeah.
It's actually interesting you just said that, because my question is about private schools. So there are private schools which I believe someone just mentioned were founded on segregation academies. And then there are foundations. There are private schools who are also built upon the premise of just giving African Americans the perfect educational opportunity, or just giving Hispanic Americans the perfect opportunity, or just giving Asian Americans with a perfect educational opportunity, all around the school, all around the country. And I'm just wondering whether you guys could touch upon the private schools and race and opportunities in private. I realize that's a completely different, or not completely different, but a rather sort of subsection, because you were talking mainly about public schools, but it is a thing that needs to be discussed. So yeah, throwing it open. And I'm going to put this here because I'm short. I couldn't figure out how to put it down. There we go.
So there's a vast difference between segregation academies that are an effort to get away from anyone who is, what we saw in Louisiana, we saw all over the country after efforts to desegregate, where like you literally trying to find any way you can to maintain segregation and barriers, right? There's a vast difference between that and what I would say are lots of different ways in which people are trying to find ways in which to provide educational opportunities for students in different parts of this country, right? Which you mentioned lots of different examples of, academies, right? That are, I wouldn't call them segregation academies. I would call them academies that are trying to serve particular populations, right? And the needs of those particular populations. And so those two things, but let's move back for a second, because I don't want on the 65th anniversary of Brown for us to forget the following thing, which is we seem to have this like constant argument about whether or not segregated schools, right, are the way to go versus, diverse schools. What, with the exception of a bunch of people who've been apparently just confirmed to be federal judges, right?
Yeah.
I think most people would agree, right? I think most black parents, and I'm gonna tell you, like, if you're doing deseg cases, you have black parents who are not on board in the same way that white parents are on board, and don't think differently, right? And so when you think about, like, in general, I think most people would want their child to be in an environment that is not entirely segregated by race, by socioeconomic status, by religion, by whatever it is, right? Most people, I'm not saying all, but most. And so let's just start with the premise that, like, it's a good thing. And whether or not we can get to that good thing, and whether that trumps or is prioritized over anything else, which is what's happening with a lot of these schools that are serving particular populations, is a bigger conversation. But if you ask me the question of, like, whether or not, there's a school in New York that's serving all black males and is doing a really good job doing it, right? Whether or not that should exist, or whether or not that's a good thing, I would tell you it's a good thing given what other opportunities are out there.
Yeah. And also it's a choice that parents made to put their kids there, unlike a lot of situations for many kids who are forced into school districts that are segregated by race and class. And I just want to go back to your question before, which was, Yeah, so I think that one of the things that you do is government and philanthropy and whoever else provides opportunities for people who want to do something different, who want to fight against segregation, an opportunity to do that, whether that's to start a school, whether it's to create schools across district lines. There's a whole host of things. There's actually federal legislation that was filed just the other day that would provide communities the opportunity to, to build, to create plans for exactly that type of thing. So you provide people the option who are swimming against the segregation tide, so to speak, and then that creates some models, that creates more and more kind of proofs of concept, and then things get normalized and conversations continue and more schools build up, and that's how things begin to change, and that's how norms begin to change, and it's going to take a really, really long time, and it's going to take intention.
And just a short also response to the most recent question, I think curriculum is key as well. I don't think we talked as much about that, but I think many of the efforts to create culturally competent schools, some of them through the charter school mechanism in some cases, are a response to a lack of political power when it comes to public school curriculum and the exclusion of entire communities and their voices from that curriculum. We know that Arizona a few years ago was banning ethnic studies classes, for example. So that, there are many different ways that we see that there's a feeling in these communities that it's not just the desire to have an inclusion into a curriculum that then creates an inferiority complex in the children that they're bringing to the public schools. They want to make sure their kids, as was said before, have a holistic, mentally healthy and physically healthy environment.
So we're actually going to have a hard stop at 8:10, so I want us to try to get through these questions, and so let's go, and I just need to give that warning.
Justin, I thought your comments were very thought-provoking, and your idea of using the reparation theory to achieve equality in the schools is an important political movement. But my question, because we're in a law school, is there a legal theory or litigation theory that can also use the reparation theory to move this forward?
Well, we know Charles Ogletree was at the forefront of that. He's no longer back there. He was at the forefront of that effort in Tulsa a few years back. And, there have been a number of legal efforts. I think Alfred Brophy is also a scholar who has written a really good book on reparations called Reparations Pro and Con, where you can learn more about some of the legal scholarship around reparations. There are theories of unjust enrichment. There are many legal theories which would justify a reparations framework. And I think your question is, could you litigate your way towards reparations as opposed to having it be through a political mechanism? So yeah, that'd be difficult. I think what's interesting is the reframing aspect of it more so. And if anyone else has any ideas on the litigation side, outside of the context which we saw in Virginia, where there was a political effort to really document the harm towards individual identified graduates or people who were isolated and were able to bring up evidence. I think outside of that, it's really a political claim where then you could see it happening at least for me, I can see it happening on a local level more so than on a national level. But if you can find progressive city councils, I think there's a political argument to be made. And I also think it's important to reframe reparations out of the enslavement context. That's one of the innovations that Charles Ogletree helped to make a reality, and also Ta-Nehisi Coates. If we look at the history of segregation in public schools as another site of injury that justifies a reparations conversation, I think that can be really beneficial.
So I just add to that, when we think about how the jurisprudence around the consideration of race in education has played out, there's different rationales for it. And so, and particularly in the context of diversity in higher education, there's been the diversity rationale, like having people go to school with other people is a good idea, right? And then there's a remedial rationale, and I think the remedial rationale, which is that there has been a long history of exclusion and oppression that needs to be actually remediated, is one that I think has its roots in reparations as well. And that's, I think, one of the ways in which we've seen that legal theory develop, and it. That was part of the theory for Brown, and it was certainly part of the theory for Bakke, and rejected in Bakke in some ways. Because we have two more questions, I won't go there, but there are ways in which, even if you look at some of the more recent jurisprudence, the remedial rationale is there, even though it's not named and acknowledged as such, and we can talk about how that plays out, but go ahead.
Can we actually take both of these questions together to allow our panelists to respond?
Okay.
So go ahead, and then Peggy, you
Great.
can.
I'm from Chile, South America, and we are, for the first time in our history, we have recorded like massive immigration issues. We've never had Black people in our country. We're like dealing with racism right now. So I wanted to ask you, from your history, from your country's history, what would you say to my country to like do it better? Like, I don't know, like we're having those problems. It's not segregation, it's not like hostile discrimination, but it is like sort of a problem. So.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and Peggy, you want to put yours on the table too?
Yikes. Of course, two questions. One is about changing demographics and the move back to the city from the suburbs, and also the gentrification that's pushing lower income people to the inner ring suburbs, and how that's gonna, how you think about that as we move forward. And the other, on the litigation end, I was wondering if some of you who talked about curriculum, you know, are hopeful about the appeals in the Sixth Circuit about the right to literacy.
Good question. Thank you. And sir, go ahead and get your question in too, and so that'll give our.
I don't have any question. I just want to make a comment. Is it okay?
I understand. I'd like to give our folks a chance to. What was that?
Let him make it.
Yes, sir.
Quickly.
You got it, please.
That's it.
My name is Kanchi Gandhi. I work here in biology department. I'm in academic line for about 49 years in India and here. So I have experience in India about the caste system, and here I come about the race system. Frequently, I'm invited to give talks in India, and besides what I talk in my subject, I motivate people telling the stories about George Washington Carver and Katherine Johnson, how in spite of their very humble or even often oppressive environment, they excelled in their own field. They become something phenomenal. So this is how I used to encourage the young audience in India. I have seen even graduate students barefooted sitting in the classroom. So I encourage them, don't give up just because you come from poverty. There should be always hope, and in spite of whatever conditions you are, try to do your job honestly and efficiently.
Thank you.
So this is how I have been giving. Just I returned from a talk 6 weeks ago. I mentioned about Katherine Johnson. I mentioned about George Washington Carver, because I always appreciate people who excel in academics.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So you all have some questions for this council, so those first two?
It'd be nice to be able to end on that, on that comment. To the question, so let me just say one note about curriculum. I think it is extraordinarily important to think about, as Professor Hansford raised, like the ways in which curriculum are an incredibly important way in which to engage students and make them feel welcome and comfortable in classrooms. The Tucson, I'll use the Tucson example, which is we actually challenged the state's ban challenge is right the right word. We addressed the state's ban on ethnic studies by saying that it was incredibly important to have those programs as part of a desegregation process, right? So we had a desegregation case there, and we basically said like it was necessary for desegregation because we saw the ways in which students were differently engaged when they had curriculum that actually centered them, right? On the right to literacy, I think in some ways, part of what we're talking about this entire time, and part of what we're talking about in Brown, is something that we didn't name, and I want to name it, which is that there's no fundamental right to education in this country, right? And so part of the right to literacy and all of the efforts to sort of think about different ways in which to basically nick at this idea that like we don't have a fundamental right to education, and how do we actually establish some kind of basic rights around that? That's what a lot of the state cases have been about. Successful, some of them very successful, some of them not, and some of them even successful and then spent 40 years trying to implement the success that they've had. So when we think about the right to literacy case, I mean, there's a lot of different views on it, in part because of the climate that we're in legally. But what I would say is, I think it's another way in which to really sort of go at, like, if this is what we think is incredibly important for our democracy, then shouldn't we at least get there, right? And in that way, another way to think about this very notion of Brown, which is education as a foundation of good citizenship.
And Chile?
Somebody else.
Chile?
No,
Don't.
that's the hardest question.
It is, but we should acknowledge it.
I would like to respond to Peggy's questions about gentrification and the changing demographics, where we're seeing many of our suburbs diversifying, for example, and then we're seeing cities. We're seeing displacement. Boston is one of the highest rates of displacement. Denver is another one, and a lot of other cities. So there's both potential for good and potential for a lot of harm. In the suburbs, I mean, a lot of demographers actually see diversifying suburbs as quite hopeful. Unfortunately, what we see in a lot of these suburbs is segregation happening. So when Black and Latinx people move to the suburbs or settle in the suburbs, we see school segregation and residential patterns get reinforced. We even see school districts working even harder to enforce those barriers or setting up new zones. It doesn't happen everywhere, but it is something to look out for. On the other hand, if people in a community really want to have a diverse and equal community and want to get together to plan in a constructive way, like folks are trying to do in Denver, for example, and in other communities that I've experienced around the country, places like Rockville Center in New York, Long Island, then it actually can be a really positive force and energizing force in a community, especially in places that were losing population and now are seeing an increase in population. One thing is that when there's gentrification, there's an enormous amount of emphasis and attention, as there should be, on folks that get displaced. But what is less talked about is the levels of segregation that increase, because that displacement oftentimes goes hand in hand with increasing segregation. So people are pushed to neighborhoods where there are lower levels of opportunity and investment and a history of disinvestment in, and that for people of color. And so that is something to worry about. On the other hand, with changing demographics in some urban spaces, if again there's planning and there's collaboration and there's power and voice among longtime residents, people of color in the community, then planning can happen so that you can have a more diverse both neighborhood community and also a school, so that the school actually reflects that growing diversity. So who knows? But it takes a deliberate, going back to Barbara's quote that she had, it takes a deliberate effort. Most people just do nothing, and then if you do nothing, that defaults to racial discrimination.
Let me try to answer. I'm not answering because it's a too hard of a question.
Chile.
But let me say one thing about where I would start. Right, absent the kind of history that we've had in this country and that many countries have around the world. One of the things we don't have here is also an idea of dignity, right? Like a constitutional right to dignity. and to humanity in that way, right? And what I would start with is to try to have the country start with the idea that everyone has dignity and humanity. And I think if you can start there, you get out of some of the ways in which we've gone down rabbit holes that have been really difficult to get out of.
That's a perfect, that's a perfect piece of advice. And, you know, and I'm afraid, so we do have other folks we need to worry about in terms of the time here. So if you can just ask a question, and then you're going to have to see if you can pigeonhole somebody later to answer it, because we're going to have to stop soon. So just put your
And we
questions.
also, in this audience, have some amazing
It's-
people,
it's
FYI,
incredible.
like who could be up here, who should be up here.
So quick question,
Yeah.
and okay, go.
Very
go.
good. How can the questions of race start being discussed, the issue of race?
Okay, all right. Quick but not easy. Okay.
Well, this is chiming off of, I'm actually quite surprised that New Jersey came up so many times. I'm from originally New Jersey. I apologize, no, I'm just kidding. So I was really surprised, but not to my surprise, the towns that you named, Montclair and Morristown are predominantly white and very affluent towns. Not the town I grew up in. So the question is how, because segregation does treat opportunity different according to race, how does, you know, the underserved population lift themselves up? Because obviously no one's gonna come and do it for us.
So, you know, it's really, you know, listen, it's really terrible to have to do this because this is a conversation that we've desperately needed and can and will go on quite a while. But all good things have to come to an end, I'm afraid, or they do. And so I'd like us to join in thanking our panelists for joining, and thank you all for being here.